Understand something most people get completely wrong about silence, especially when it comes from an avoidant. The instinct is to take it personally, to assume that their distance is a reflection of your worth, your value, or something you did wrong. But that interpretation, while natural, is fundamentally inaccurate. Because for an avoidant, silence is rarely about the other person. It's about what's happening internally in unresolved conflict they don't yet have the tools to face. Directly, an avoidant isn't running from you. They're running from the emotional intensity that being with you activates inside them. And that intensity isn't always negative. In fact, it's often the opposite. It's closeness, connection, and the vulnerability that comes with genuinely caring about someone. That's where the contradiction begins. Because on one hand, they want connection like anyone else. But on the other hand, connection triggers a deep, almost unconscious fear of losing. Independence, fear of being overwhelmed, fear of being exposed in ways they don't know how to manage. So what do? They withdraw. Not as a calculated move, not as a punishment, but as a form of self-regulation. It's the only strategy they've learned that gives them a sense of control again. Silence becomes their shield. Distance becomes their stability. And during that silence, something important is happening. It may look like absence from the outside, but internally, it's not empty yet. It's a space filled with tension. They're replaying conversations. They're analyzing what they felt. They're trying to make sense of why something that felt good also felt so threatening. And here's the part most people don't see. They don't fully understand it themselves. That's why it looks confusing. That's why it feels inconsistent. This is where psychology meets philosophy. Because what you're witnessing is a person caught between two opposing forces, the human need for connection and the human instinct for self-preservation. And when those two forces collide without awareness, without emotional tools, the result is avoidance. Not because love isn't there, but because love feels dangerous. So when they finally come back, when they finally face you after that silence, it's not random timing. It's not convenience. It's the moment when the internal pressure shifts, when the distance no longer feels like relief, but like loss, when the absence of connection becomes heavier than fear of it. That's the truth most people miss. Silence in this context is not indifference. It's conflict. Deep, unresolved, internal conflict. And if you misread that silence, if you interpret it only through your own emotional lens, you'll respond in a way that reinforces the very cycle you're trying to break. Understanding this doesn't mean you excuse the behavior. It means you see it clearly. You stop reacting to the surface and start recognizing the pattern underneath it. Because once you see the pattern, you're no longer controlled by it. And that's the shift. The moment you stop asking, why did they leave me? And start asking, what are they struggling to face within themselves? You move from confusion to clarity, from reaction to awareness. Because in the end, their silence was never a statement about your value. It was a reflection of their capacity. And when they finally come back, this is where people expect some kind of emotional breakthrough. They imagine a moment of honesty, of openness, maybe even an apology that explains everything. But that expectation comes from how you process emotion, not how they do. Because when an avoidant returns, they don't come back overflowing with vulnerability. They come back regulated, controlled, and measured. On the surface, it can feel confusing. You've just experienced distance, silence, maybe even emotional absence, and now they're standing in front of you as if nothing dramatic happened. Calm voice, neutral tone, minimal. They expression. And your first instinct might be to think they don't care enough, that if it really meant something, they would show it more clearly. But again, that interpretation misses what's actually happening underneath. For an avoidant, emotional control is not indifference, it's safety. It's the way they prevent themselves from feeling overwhelmed. When they reconnect with you, they're stepping back into the very environment that triggered their withdrawal in the first place. So instead of diving in emotionally, they manage their internal state carefully. They ration what they show. They stay composed, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much. and don't trust their ability to handle it. Think about that paradox for a moment. The more significant the connection is, the more regulated they appear, not less. This is where a lot of relationships break down, because one person is looking for emotional confirmation while the other is trying to maintain emotional stability. And those two needs, if not understood, start to clash. You might push for openness, for clarity, for reassurance. And the more you push, the more they tighten their control, because now the emotional intensity is rising again. It becomes a cycle you need for expression meets their need for containment. But if you step back and observe it differently, you start to see that their calmness is not the absence of feeling. It's the management of it. It's a strategy they've developed over time, often unconsciously, to avoid losing themselves in emotion. Because somewhere in their past, losing control emotionally wasn't safe. It led to pain, rejection, or instability. So now, even in moments where connection is possible, they default to control. And when they speak, listen carefully not just to the words, but to the effort behind them. An avoidant doesn't naturally move toward emotional exposure. So even small expressions, even simple attempts to reconnect, carry more weight than they appear to. It's not about dramatic declarations. It's about subtle risks. The mistake is expecting them to communicate like someone who is emotionally fluent when they're still learning the language. If you judge them by a standard they haven't yet developed, you'll always feel like something is missing. But if you recognize where they are, you start to see progress where you once saw distance. This doesn't mean you lower your standards. It means you adjust your perception. You learn to differentiate between emotional absence and emotional protection, because they are not the same thing. And in that understanding, something shifts. You stop chasing intensity and start recognizing intention. You stop reacting to what isn't being said and start noticing what is, even if it's quiet, even if it's imperfect. Because when an avoidant comes back controlled instead of vulnerable, it's not a lack of depth. It's the only way they know how to stay. And sometimes staying, however, imperfectly, is the first real step toward change. And this is where your attention has to sharpen, because if you rely only on what's being said, you're going to miss the most important part of the interaction. When an avoidant returns, words are not their primary language. Behavior is. Not because they're trying to be vague or evasive, but because expressing emotion verbally requires a level of internal clarity they often haven't fully developed. Action, on the other hand, feels safer. It is. Indirect, it's controlled, and it allows them to engage without overexposing themselves. So instead of listening for big statements, you start watching for small consistencies. Do they show up when they said they would? Do they initiate contact even if it's brief or understated? Do they make an effort to remain present a little longer than they used to? These things might seem minor on the surface, but within the psychology of an avoidant, they represent something significant, because every small action is a negotiation with their own discomfort. Every step toward you is a step against their instinct to withdraw. This is where most people miscalculate. They wait for a clear verbal confirmation, something that sounds like certainty, commitment, or emotional depth. And when they don't hear it, they assume it's not there. But in doing that, they overlook the evidence that's already in front of them. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore words entirely. It means you recalibrate how much weight you give them. Because for someone who is avoidant, words can be delayed, incomplete, or even inconsistent, not necessarily because they're dishonest, but because they're still processing. Their internal experience doesn't always translate cleanly into language. Behavior, however, is harder to fake over time. Patterns tell the truth. Not isolated moments, not one grand gesture, but repeated actions. If they continue to show up, if they gradually increase their presence, if their efforts become more consistent rather than sporadic, then something real is happening beneath the surface. It may not look like traditional emotional expression, but it is movement. It is progress. At the same time, this is where discernment becomes critical, because there's a difference between meaningful effort and minimal engagement. An avoidant taking genuine steps will still be consistent within their capacity. There will be a sense of direction, even if it's slow. But if the behavior is erratic, if presence is followed by long disappearances with no evolution, then you're not looking at growth, you're looking at repetition. So the question shifts. Instead of asking, what are they saying to me? You begin asking, what are they showing me over time? That question brings clarity because it removes the ambiguity of interpretation and replaces it with observation. And this is also where your own emotional discipline matters. Because if you're only tuned into words, you'll either chase reassurance or react to its absence. But when you start observing actions, you step into a more grounded position. You're no longer pulled into every fluctuation of communication. You're anchored in patterns. That changes the dynamic completely. Because now, instead of trying to extract meaning from every conversation, you're allowing time to reveal truth. And time, more than anything else, exposes intention. It shows you whether someone is moving toward connection or away from it. An avoidant may not always tell you how they feel, but they will always show you what they're willing to do. And in the end, what someone consistently does will always carry more truth than what they occasionally say. And this brings us to a subtle but critical phase that most people completely misread. When an avoidant comes back, they don't return with immediate emotional transparency. They return with awareness and with caution. What looks like hesitation on the surface is actually assessment. They are reading the environment, studying your reactions, and trying to determine one thing above all else. Is it safe to open again? Now understand what safe means in this context. It doesn't just mean you won't hurt them. It means they won't lose control of themselves. For an avoidant, emotional safety is deeply tied to autonomy. If opening up feels like it will lead to pressure, expectation, or emotional overwhelm, their instinct is to retreat again. So when they re-enter your space, they are not just reconnecting. They are evaluating. They listen more carefully than they speak. They notice your tone, your timing, your responses. If there's tension, urgency, or emotional intensity coming from you, it registers immediately. And even if your intention is clarity or closeness, what they may experience is pressure. That pressure doesn't motivate them to open it, reinforces the very fear that caused them to withdraw in the first place. So they test, not in a manipulative sense, but in a protective one. They might share something small and watch how you respond. They might engage briefly and then pull back just to see if space is respected. They might reappear casually, almost as if nothing happened, to gauge whether the interaction remains stable or becomes emotionally charged. These are not random behaviors. They are checkpoints. Each one is a way of asking, can I exist here without being overwhelmed? This is where your response becomes pivotal. If you meet their cautious, approach with intensity, demanding explanations, pushing for emotional clarity, revisiting everything at once, you collapse the space they are trying to build. It becomes too much, too fast, and their system reacts the only way it knows how, by shutting down again. But if you meet that moment with grounded, presence clear, calm, and self-contained, you create something different. You demonstrate that connection doesn't have to come at the cost of stability. That emotional closeness doesn't. They automatically lead to chaos. And that, over time, begins to shift their internal expectation. Now, this doesn't mean you suppress your needs or avoid important conversations. It means you understand timing. You recognize that openness is not something you can force. It's something that emerges when the conditions feel right. And those conditions are built through consistency, not intensity. What's happening here is deeply psychological. The avoidant is essentially running a series of internal. Each interaction either confirms their fear or challenges it. If their fear is confirmed, the pattern repeats. If it's challenged gently, consistently, without pressure, something begins to change. And here's the deeper philosophical layer. People don't open up because they're told to. They open up because their experience shifts, because what once felt unsafe starts to feel manageable, because the environment no longer triggers the same defensive response. So the real question is not, Why aren't they opening up yet? The real question is, what kind of space is being created between us? Because that space determines everything that follows. An avoidant will not rush into vulnerability, but they will move toward it step by step if the ground beneath them feels stable enough to stand on. And in that process, patience is not passive, it's strategic, because every calm response, every moment of grounded interaction is quietly answering the question they're too guarded to. They ask out loud, is it finally safe to stay? And beneath all of this, the silence, the control, the cautious reentry, there's another layer that often goes unspoken, but it's incredibly powerful. It's the quiet presence of guilt and regret, not always expressed, not always even fully acknowledged, but very often felt. Because when an avoidant steps away, it doesn't mean they stop thinking about what they left behind. In many cases, distance amplifies awareness. Without the immediate pressure of the relationship, they begin to process it from afar. They revisit conversations, moments, the way you showed up, the consistency you offered. And in that reflection, something starts to surface an understanding that their withdrawal had an impact. Now, here's where it gets complex. Avoidants are not always comfortable with emotions like guilt. Guilt requires accountability. It requires facing the reality that their actions affected someone else in a meaningful way. And if they already struggle with emotional processing, that kind of realization can feel heavy. So instead of openly expressing it, they internalize it. It shows up indirectly. It shows up in the way they reappear not overly confident, not entirely at ease, but measured. It shows up in small attempts to reconnect, sometimes without addressing the past directly. It shows up in a certain softness, a subtle shift in energy that wasn't there before. They may not say, I regret what happened, but their behavior begins to carry. That weight. And this is where people often misinterpret things again. Because if the apology isn't explicit, if the acknowledgement isn't verbal, it can feel like nothing has changed. It can feel like they're just picking up where they left off without taking responsibility. But what you're actually seeing in many cases is someone who is trying to move closer while still grappling with the discomfort of facing what they did. It's not avoidance in the same way as before, it's hesitation rooted. In self-awareness, they're still developing. Regret for an avoidant is rarely loud. It's quiet. It's reflective. It builds over time rather than being released in a single moment. And here's the deeper dynamic at play. The very thing they were trying to avoid, emotional discomfort, doesn't disappear in distance. It transforms. It becomes longing. It becomes curiosity. It becomes a question they can't fully silence. What if I handled that differently? That question is often what brings them together. Back. Not just to reconnect, but to resolve something internally. To see if the connection still exists. To see if there's an opportunity to engage differently this time, even if they don't yet know how to do that perfectly. But again, their approach will reflect their capacity. If they're still learning, their expression of regret may come through actions rather than words, through presence rather than explanation, through small, consistent efforts rather than one grand emotional moment. This is where your awareness becomes essential. Because if you expect regret to look a certain way, clear, verbal, immediatu might overlook the forms it's actually taking. And in doing that, you risk misreading intention. At the same time, awareness doesn't mean blind acceptance. Regret without growth becomes repetition. So what matters is not just whether they feel something, but whether that feeling begins to shape their behavior over time. Because real regret doesn't just look backward. It changes what happens next. And when an avoidant returns carrying that quiet weight, what you're witnessing is not just someone revisiting the past. You're witnessing someone standing at the edge of their own emotional limitation, deciding consciously or not whether they're ready to move beyond it. And in the end, the truth is simple. Unspoken regret still reveals itself through effort. And effort is where change begins. And this is where everything converges. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a single conversation, but in a quiet turning point that determines the direction of everything that follows. When an avoidant finally faces you after a long silence, what you're really standing in is a decision point whether this dynamic evolves or whether it simply repeats itself in a more familiar form. Because patterns don't change just because two people reconnect. They change when awareness is followed by different behavior. And this is true for both sides. At this stage, there's often subtle sense of possibility. You might feel that something is different this time. Maybe they're a little more present. Maybe the communication, while still measured, is slightly more consistent. Maybe there's a quiet effort that wasn't there before, and it's tempting to interpret that as transformation. But here's where precision matters. Effort is not the same as change. Effort is the beginning of change, but without consistency, it fades back into pattern. So the real question becomes, is there movement, or is there just a moment? An avoidant who is genuinely shifting will begin to tolerate what they previously avoided. Not perfectly, not all at once, but noticeably. They will stay a little longer in difficult conversations. They will resist the urge to disappear at the first sign of emotional intensity. They will begin in small ways to trade control for connection. And those moments, while subtle, are significant because they signal an expansion of capacity. But if the underlying fear remains unaddressed, the cycle will reassert itself. The same triggers will produce the same responses. Closeness will again lead to withdrawal. Silence will return. And what felt like progress will reveal itself as a temporary deviation rather than a lasting shift. This is why boundaries become essential, not as a form of control over the other person, but as a form of clarity for yourself. Because growth requires structure. It requires an environment where both people are, they accountable to something beyond their immediate emotional impulses. Without that, even the best intentions dissolve under pressure. Now, here's the part that requires honesty. You cannot carry the growth for both people. You can create space, you can respond with awareness, you can recognize patterns, but you cannot do their internal work for them. And if you try, you'll find yourself pulled back into the same cycle, only with more understanding and more exhaustion. So this moment asks something deeper of you. It asks you to observe without illusion, to recognize not just what is being offered, but what is being sustained. Because consistency over time is the only reliable indicator of real change. And there's also a philosophical truth here that often gets overlooked. Potential is not reality. Who someone could become, how they might grow, what they're capable of under the right conditions, that's possibility. But relationships don't function on possibility. They function on behavior. Is there progression? Is there accountability? Is there a willingness, even if imperfect, to move beyond the old pattern? Or is there a return to familiarity disguised as effort? Because in the end, this is not just their turning point, it's yours. You decide whether you engage with what is real or remain attached to what could be. You decide whether this becomes a new chapter, built on awareness and evolution, or a repetition of something you already understand too well. And that decision doesn't come from emotion alone. It comes from clarity. Because when you see the pattern clearly, you no longer have to chase the outcome. You simply choose it. So when you step back and look at the entire journey from the silence to the controlled return, to the subtle actions, the emotional testing, the quiet regret, and finally this moment of decision, you start to see a pattern that is far more structured than it first appears. What once felt confusing begins to make sense. What once felt personal begins to reveal itself as psychological. An avoidant facing you after a long silence is not a random event. It is the result of internal conflict reaching a threshold. It is a person standing between fear and connection, between protection and growth. And everything you've seen their distance, their behavior, their hesitation has been part of that internal negotiation. But here's the truth that matters most, understanding. Their pattern does not mean losing yourself inside it. Because while they are navigating their fears, you are responsible for your clarity. While they are learning how to stay, you are deciding what staying means for you. And that distinction is everything. Without it, empathy turns into overextension. Awareness turns into tolerance of cycles that don't change. Real connection is not built on one person adapting endlessly to the limitations of the other. It's built when both people expand, when both become more aware, more accountable, more capable of meeting each other in reality, not just intention. So yes, you can understand the avoidant. You can recognize their patterns, interpret their actions, and respond with intelligence instead of reaction.